Greetings, programs. Today I'll be covering mechanics surrounding one of Diablo 3's coolest looking skills, Death Nova, with a particular focus on Blood Nova, Iron Rose, and Simulacrum cast Novas. I will cover attack speed breakpoints with Iron Rose later at length, but if all you care about is the most beneficial breakpoint, I'll list that on the screen now. These attack speeds will let you hit the 10 frames per tick damage interval on Scythe and Blood, which in return hits the 20 frames per attack interval in regards to Iron Rose procs. Now to kick it off with some manually cast Death Nova mechanics. All runes of Death Nova cost 20 essence before resource cost reduction, and Blood Nova additionally costs 10% of the Necromancer's total health before life cost reductions are applied. Tindral and Bone Nova have a proc coefficient of 25%. All other runes, including Unruned, feature a proc coefficient of 50%. Tindral Nova provides a 1% heal, fairly underwhelming considering the low damage from the rune, but the heal effect does appear to scale with density. Unruned Death Nova, Blight, and Blood Nova have a radius of 25 yards. Bone Nova radius is 12 yards. Unstable Compound starts at 20 yards and increases 5 yards apiece per cast, all the way up to 30 yards after 2 casts of Death Nova. Successive casts will preserve the 30-yard radius with Unstable Compound. Attack speed breakpoints with manually cast Death Novas mirror an attack speed formula of frames per attack is equivalent to 60 frames divided by 1.2 times APS, and this is all rounded down. Notably, this 1.2 multiplier does produce lower intervals as compared to Grim Scythe with Swift Harvesting. Swift Harvesting giving a 1.15 multiplier instead, of course. However, it can cause massive desync with stricken internal cooldowns, meaning manually cast Death Nova and Grim Scythe with Swift Harvesting are sadly some of the worst stricken stackers in the game. Also notably, D3planner isn't listing the correct formula at current for its displayed interval on the Skills Effects tab with Death Nova manually cast, right? So it's basically not including the 1.2 multiplier. So if you want to calculate your manually cast Death Nova interval, you'll have to do it by hand in the meantime. Manually cast Death Novas from the Necromancer can proc area damage. However, at least from my testing, this is the only method that will proc area damage. Now for some Iron Rose focused mechanics. So Scythe and Blood must be channeled on a target to proc the Iron Rose. You cannot simply channel into the air or into the void. It just won't work. This has implications when rifting, of course, because if the target of your channel dies while channeling, your channel will be interrupted. I suggest prioritizing healthier enemies when channeling Scythe and Blood for this reason. The Necromancer's Iron Rose proc always creates a Blood Nova with 25 yards radius, regardless of if Blood Nova is on the skill board or not. Iron Rose procs do not remove health from the player, even if Blood Nova is placed on the skill board. This is actually quite a nice perk to have, right? The Iron Rose procced Blood Novas cannot proc area damage. Bloodtide Blades 5 times damage multiplier is working as expected, as far as I can tell, to increase both single and multi-target, as long as the targets are within 25 yards of the Necromancer. This works for both Necromancer and Simulacrum-based or procced Novas. Mantle of Channeling multiplier is working as expected to increase the damage of Death Novas while Scythe and Blood is being channeled. This includes both Necrocast, Iron Rose procced Blood Novas, and Simulacrum cast / procced Death Novas. Delay is as described, about 1 second. All right, let's focus in now on some Simulacrum-based behaviors with Death Nova, some mechanics with Simulacrum. Patch 269 introduced a revised legendary power for Haunted Visions, allowing Simulacrums to last indefinitely after being summoned, hence our desire here for more knowledge in this area, right? First, how does the Iron Rose work with Simulacrums? Simulacrums cast Unruined Death Nova when Death Nova is not on the skill bar. However, Simulacrums will assume the rune of Death Nova if it is placed on the skill bar. This is notably different than how the Necromancer's own Iron Rose procced Blood Novas are treated. To be honest, I actually prefer how the Simulacrums assume this rune from the skill bar, and would prefer if in the future changes were made to the game, to Iron Rose in particular, to allow any rune, not just Blood Nova, to proc from the Iron Rose. That'd be kind of nice. While we do have some freedom here between having a lot of physical runes with Death Nova, we are locked into choosing physical. My general take on running Bone Spikes versus Blood Nova on the skill bar is that the extra 8 yards radius from Blood Nova is vastly more valuable than the somewhat 4.5% DPS you could get from picking Bone Spikes. There are some quirks with how the Simulacrums assume this rune on the skill bar. Tendril Nova does not appear to proc healing from either the Simulacrum cast Novas or Iron Rose proc Novas. I'll get more into recovery a little more later. The radius with Simulacrum cast Blood Novas is actually smaller than the Necromancer's Blood Nova. It's kind of surprising, yes, I know, but I estimate the Simulacrum cast Blood Novas are about 20 yards in radius. Even though this radius is less than the 25 that we would be expecting, it still provides the best mix of coverage and DPS, in my opinion. The Simulacrum's Death Nova proc always occurs exactly 9 frames after your own Death Nova casts or Iron Rose procs. Simulacrum Nova damage is based off of average weapon damage range, same as the Necromancer's Novas. Simulacrum cast Death Novas can crit separately, similar to the Necromancer's Nova attacks, and Simulacrum proc Novas from the Iron Rose cannot proc area damage, and Simulacrum proc Novas from manually cast Death Novas also cannot proc area damage. Tasker and Theo has no effect on the attack rate or proc rate of the Simulacrums, and Scent of Blood, the Curse from Frailty, does not increase Simulacrum proc Death Nova damage. Enforcer, similarly, with that pet damage, does not increase Simulacrum proc Death Nova damage. So moving along to Leech, and when I say Leech, I mean the Leech Curse. So we're going to be talking about Leech Curse mechanics. Death Nova functions similar to how Grim Scythe functions with the Simulacrums in regards to Leech. Simulacrum proc Novas will scale returns from Leech based on their HP, not the Necromancer's HP. Since Simulacrums can have HP values that are many times more than your own, and the Leech Curse can be applied to multiple targets, the amount of recovery from this mechanism is simply off the charts, right? Leech will be the single most advantageous recovery option, have no doubts about this. I would highly recommend including Leech in your Simulacrum-based Nova build. This is yet another reason to boost your life and vitality, so life percent and vitality in your build. These not only increase your toughness, but also keep your Simulacrums alive, while simultaneously increasing your own recovery. Considering affixes also, we don't have to gear area damage, and our attack speed breakpoint here is fairly easy to gear for. This is quite nice in allowing the space on gearing needed to place defensive affixes. Additionally, our relatively low Iron Rose proc interval is also really nice for recovery. Longer intervals between Simulacrum Nova procs lead to a lowered rate of recovery. This is yet another reason to be hitting that preferred attack speed breakpoint. Scythe of the Cycle has some pretty interesting interactions here with Death Nova. First off, the Simulacrum casts don't proc the reduction of the bone armor duration at all, so they don't have anything to do with that. However, the Necromancer's own Iron Rose procced Blood Novas do, as well as, of course, the manually cast Blood Novas. At 20 frames per attack interval, this results in a total depletion of a 60-second bone armor duration within about 5.16 seconds time. If you were to run a 30 frames per attack interval instead, this duration is depleted still within about 6.5 to 7 seconds time. Scythe of the Cycle increases damage of the Nova by 5 times as expected, while Bone Armor is active. This is true for both manually cast and Iron Rose procced Novas, and both the Necrocast procced and Simulacrum procced Novas take advantage of this multiplier. So, will Scythe of the Cycle be more desirable than Tregul's Corroded Fang? That's a good question, right? For pushing, I would say definitely not. You give up just too many affixes to place cooldown reduction to be able to maintain the uptime on the Scythe of the Cycle bone armor duration. Becomes a toughness issue for both yourself and your simulacrums. You're giving up Decrepify and Frailty. You're losing out on that 30% DR and the 15% Frailty effect, right? So, on top of all of these, bone armor often runs out of duration even with this higher CDR investment. So, sometimes you may lose the bonus anyway, right? It's just harder to manage and maintain within the Rift. My recommendation for pushing is to run Tregul's Corroded Fang with Curse Scythe on the skill bar, allowing you to get those extra curses, right? For speeds, solo especially, this might be a different story, as you'd be able to make more sacrifices in this manner to get and sustain the higher multiplier from Scythe of the Cycle. I'll keep you updated as to my progress with this configuration as my testing progresses. Right now, I've been focusing my efforts on testing the solo push variation. Now to discuss attack speed in relation to the Iron Rose, attack speed mechanics in particular. Could be from Iron Rose procced Novas, or it could be from Simulacrum procced Novas that were emulating your Iron Rose proc attack, right? First off, the damage interval, or the tick rate, of Siphon Blood is going to be, the base tick rate interval is going to be 0.35 seconds, or 21 frames. This is going to be very important going forward because it's included in the attack speed formula. The attack speed formula is such that this 21 frame interval is divided by your sheet attack speed, and then that's multiplied in the quotient by your swift harvesting, which is 1.15 if you have it enabled, right, for your build. And yes, swift harvesting helps out greatly here, seeing as it is a global multiplier to attack speed within this Siphon Blood attack speed tick rate formula, right? So if you weren't using swift harvesting before, I'd highly recommend placing this passive. After much testing, I found that an 18 frame internal cooldown also exists, preventing us from re-procking our Blood Novas with Iron Rose if our tick rate was such that it's less than this, which it does often occur to be less than this. Because this internal cooldown is only about 17% less than the dividend within the attack speed formula, which is 21, this makes attack speed breakpoint ranges surrounding whole number attack speeds, for example 1, 2 attacks per second, 3 attacks per second, more appealing to gear for. Our goal with this tick rate is to get it to line up as close as possible with the internal cooldown without hitting it exactly. We're going to be shooting for a 19 frames per tick interval at best, right? But as I'll discuss later, this 19 frames per tick goal isn't exactly realistic for a one-handed weapon configuration. Because of this 18 frame internal cooldown, the best we can opt for to hit is actually a 10 frames per tick interval, allowing us to proc Nova with Iron Rose once every 20 frames, or 20 frames per attack. Let's dive into this internal cooldown a little bit more. The 18 frame internal cooldown interval certainly causes the Iron Rose proc novas to act weirdly when the frames per tick rate lines up precisely with it at 18 frames. My observation has been one of two things happens when the Blood Siphon tick rate lines up precisely with the ICD. Either it blocks the nova from proccing or it doesn't. And from my testing, this state appears to be perfectly random, favoring one or the other 50%, right? Because it sometimes disregards the internal cooldown in this scenario, these attack speed breakpoints are actually not as bad as they could have been and end up feeling more impactful than they actually are. Indeed, I've heard many players describe this breakpoint as being the best, but they are wrong. When you average out the slow 27 frames per attack interval cadences with the super quick, bursty 18 frame intervals, it turns out that this breakpoint from about 2.0996 to 2.33 attacks per second, even though it produces the lowest interval burst you'll ever see with an Iron Rose based Blood Nova build, it still only averages to about 22.5 frames per attack. This is 12.5% lower DPS than the attack speed breakpoint I'm going to recommend, and it requires even more itemization and affixes to hit, so it's definitely not worth gearing for. Notably, the 1.1052 attack speed to 1.16 attack speed breakpoint shows an even lower average 27 frames per attack interval and shows similar bursty behavior. All other breakpoints displayed an even interval, no burst, no randomness or misalignment with the internal cooldown. So a 9 frames per attack damage interval won't get us what we need. 9 times 2 is 18, which is, of course, aligned with this breakpoint that exhibiting the randomness. We need to lower our attack speed to hit the 10 frames per attack damage interval. 10 times 2 is 20. 20 FBA will be the quickest we can proc Iron Rose in a single-handed weapon configuration. Recommended gearing for the 20 FBA interval includes a weapon affix, a ring affix, Charisma Sentence notably rolls attack speed by default, so in my guides at least, I will be keeping the Charisma Sentence affix, and yeah. The Enchantress, a 10% Paragon attack speed roll, and then also the Swift Harvesting passive. Imperfect gearing, however, if your affixes on either the weapon or the ring roll, this attack speed affix, are not perfected all the way to 7%, you will definitely need another affix, an additional affix. I recommend to roll either on gloves or a second ring for the second affix. Neatly, however, if you have to roll this second affix for whatever reason, you can go as low as a 5% weapon affix and a 5% ring with this 5% additional affix, either ring or gloves, and you will still hit the 20 FBA breakpoint. So basically, if your items are not perfected, at least you have some freedom here, but it would be more advantageous to get those perfected rolls because you could save an affix slot. The DPS increase that you will receive from hitting the 20 frames per attack interval can be anywhere from 30% all the way up to 60% DPS increase just by optimizing for this breakpoint. This, of course, is depending on the breakpoint that you're coming from, and if you were or weren't using Swift Harvesting before knowing this, right? Let's cover some other things that would affect anyone looking to put together an Iron Rose Simulacrum-based build. Speed pylons. When you click them, and you're at your 20 FBA interval, this will put you all the way up to 24 frames per attack. Unfortunately, a loss of about 20% DPS output for the duration of a speed pylon. Very important if you're running a Flavor of Time, for example. However, a speed pylon can still be useful for those elite spawns. So if you want to click the pylon and get that higher multiplier via the Blood Tide Blade, since that scales with density, and plus get, I guess, a little bit better recovery. You can still click this pylon. I would reserve that probably for Rift Guardians, though. Notably, as mentioned earlier, Swift Harvesting is actually pretty terrible for Stricken stacking when combined with Grim's Scythe. This is because the Stricken internal cooldown is based off your sheet attacks per second, but your Scythe FBA interval is lowered below that ICD, meaning it ends up being really inefficient if you are putting Swift Harvesting on the build. This leaves you with using Blood Siphon for Stricken stacking, which, as we know, cannot be it's not exactly the most efficient Stricken stacker either. However, I suppose it could be worse. It's just a shame we couldn't gear without Swift Harvesting to be able to stack Stricken more efficiently with Grim Scythe. To be clear, I think Swift Harvesting allowing us to gear anywhere from 10 to 20% higher DPS is more important than the faster Stricken here, but it definitely hurts, especially when we get to the Rift Guardian. It means our Rift Guardian spawns will have to be even more reliant on density, summons, and pylons, more specific, right? While I haven't tested it yet, manually casting Death Nova shouldn't be very good at stacking Stricken either, because that comes with an innate 1.2 times multiplier in the quotient for the formula as well. So I guess Siphon Blood is the best Stricken stacker here. I'll continue testing it, of course, and I'll try to update here in the description or in the video comments as well. So keep a lookout there. If I find anything relating to a better method of Stricken stacking, I'll be sure to let you know. So how I went about confirming this testing with Iron Rose and Blood Nova was I actually took video of different attack speeds. And I didn't quite know in the beginning certain things about the formulas. For example, I didn't know if it rounded up or rounded down. Or I didn't know the ICD. I knew an ICD existed. I just based on how Blood Nova was behaving, I just didn't know exactly where, right? So these were unknowns that were sort of preventing me from knowing the full picture. So I was sort of stabbing in the dark, if you will, for quite a while, which is why you see so many data points here, so many columns, if you will, of me actually plotting out the exact frames from each test video and finding the difference between those frames. And that would give me an average, and then I would round that to find the actual, the likely frames per attack interval from that test, right? And after a while, I figured out that, hey, this is rounding down, and also there's an 18 frames per tick interval, or the 18 frame internal cooldown, right? And once I knew those things, I could then go and actually plot the formula and figure out the exact, like, this particular attack speed will result in this FBA based on an 18 frame internal cooldown and the fact that the formula that's been presented to us from the D3planner data mine is exact and true, right? So we have our most desirable breakpoint right here. You can see it, I've color coded it nice and green. You can see it here with Swift Harvesting as well. Notably, the 22 FPA interval, while nice, if you happen to have been gearing this one before, it's not so bad. It's still 10%, DPS less, and it's quite easy to actually hit this rather than this. So I'd say if you're, trying something before to increase your attack speed, actually try and hit the 20 FPA interval is quite nice. Down here we see another very favorable interval, but unfortunately it's only at 1.1 attacks per second, which means you could only gear this theoretically if you were going for a two-handed configuration. So if you were wearing a two-hander and cubing a two-hander of some kind, or cubing a different weapon of some kind, you could theoretically drop all of your attack speed, even off of your Crisbin if it was being worn, and you'd be able to hit 1.1 attacks per second with a two-handed Scythe and hit this breakpoint, right? So pretty nifty stuff that we've discovered from this actual plot of the formula and figuring out of everything. You know, down here in this section, I've got a little bit zoomed in because over here I've only gone into the hundredths, but right here I've done the borders of the favorable breakpoints so you can get like a closer look of exactly where you'd want to be. And I also summarized this out to the side, so if you just want to read the text here, you can go ahead and do that, right? And yeah, so that's a summary of the spreadsheet here. Quick note about the frame intervals that were aligned with the ICD. I actually sometimes took a little bit more data points. I took 16 data points typically. 16 procs, Iron Rose procs is where I counted. But I took some more on occasion just to get a better read of, you know, since the ICD is favoring randomly being enabled or being inactive, it's sort of wonky in that the average value actually has to have a lot more data points to get closer to into what I would consider the true FPA here for each of those ranges, which you have one right here, and then we have one on the lower end here at like 1.11 to 1.16, right? So, and that will about do it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed this overview of Death Nova mechanics, Iron Rose mechanics, Simulacrum mechanics, tons of attack speeds, area damage, Leech. We went all over the map on this one, and sure, hopefully kept our sanity. Anyways, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Try as best I can anyway. Drop me a like, and thank you for hanging out. I'll be putting together a push build based on these findings as soon as I can. It's just taking a little bit longer to get there in testing still, and hopefully a speed build of some kind as well. That would be interesting, wouldn't it? Anyways, thank you and take care.